Okay, in this video, I'm going to be introducing categorical syllogisms and the various kinds of features and sort of properties that categorical syllogisms have. Now, and just as categorical propositions have kind of nitpicky grammatical rules concerning standard form, categorical propositions, well, there are also rules for standard form categorical syllogisms here. Okay, so let's get the marker board out here and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so when we are talking about, whoops, fix that, standard form categorical syllogisms, all right, expand this a little bit. Okay, so rule number one for standard form is this: all three propositions, so two premises and one conclusion, must be standard form categorical propositions. Okay, so keep in mind that a syllogism is a deductive argument that has exactly three statements, exactly two premises, and exactly one conclusion. All right, so if you're dealing with a categorical argument that has more than two premises or less than two premises, it's either what's known as a sorites or an anthemum. That's fine. So what you can do is actually fill in a missing premise. But if you've got three premises that are stated and then an intermediate premise, you can actually break that up into two different categorical syllogisms, which just have sort of overlapping terms. Okay. Now, and since you need exactly three statements, two premises, exactly two premises, and exactly one conclusion, you must have exactly three terms. Okay, now, and then the three terms for categorical syllogisms are going to be minor term, major term, and the middle term. Okay, now, so how exactly do we determine what these terms are? Okay, so the minor term is the subject term of the conclusion. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is find the conclusion of the syllogism. Whatever the subject term of the conclusion is, that is going to be your minor term. Okay, the major term is the predicate term of the conclusion. Okay, now, and then the middle term is the term that appears in both premises but not conclusion. All right, so that is going to determine what your terms are. So you need exactly three terms. You're going to have a minor term, a major term, and a middle term. So again, as I indicated in the last video, if there are times where you have more than three terms or even less than three terms, you could be missing a premise, or you might need to change things around using obversion or contraposition to reduce the number of terms. Okay, so you need to have exactly three terms. Okay, now this is a semantical issue. It's an issue with semantics, but the three terms must be used in the same sense. Okay, so this has to do more with ambiguity with language, right? So if I say something like I had a date last night, okay, well, clearly date could mean A, sort of a social outing with my wife, or it could also mean B, a piece of, a piece of fruit, right? So when I say I had a date last night, I could mean that I went out on a social outing with my wife, or I could mean that I ate a piece of fruit. Okay, so if I use the word date to mean social outing in one premise, then I shouldn't switch the meaning to a piece of fruit in another premise. So when we say that the terms have to be used in the same sense, we're saying, okay, well, what the term means in one premise can't change in the course of a different premise. Okay, so If the terms are ambiguous, we just need to make sure that we're communicating the same thing. Okay, now, and that's the case not only with categorical logic. This is the case anytime we're trying to communicate effectively. We need to make sure that our terminology is clear and that it's not ambiguous or it's not vague. It doesn't admit of borderline cases, things like that. Okay. All right. Now, and then the fourth rule is that the major term, or I'm sorry, the major premise. So this is premise that contains the major term is listed first. Okay. The minor premise. So the premise that contains the minor term is listed second. The conclusion is listed last. Okay, now, and that's one of those rules that is particularly nitpicky. And here's why. The order of the premises and the conclusion does not change whether the syllogism itself is valid or invalid. Okay, so if you list the conclusion first and then you list the premises, that doesn't change whether it's valid or invalid. If you list the minor premise first and the major premise second, so it's not standard form. Again, whether the syllogism is in standard form with respect to Rule 4 has nothing to do with whether the syllogism is valid or invalid. Changing the order of the premises this way does not affect, classical validity in any meaningful kind of way. So simply switching the placement of the premises or listing the conclusion first rather than last, that has nothing to do with validity and invalidity. This is just, as far as the nitpicky ordering, syntaxical rules of what a syllogism categorically has to be in order to be in standard form. This is one of those nitpicky rules. Okay. Now, and the reason why it needs to be listed this way, why the major premise needs to be listed first, the minor premise needs to be listed second, and then the conclusion needs to be listed last, is because we actually use a shorthand notation to label syllogisms. Okay, we actually use a shorthand notation here. Now, so what the shorthand notation represents, first of all, is the mood of the syllogism. Okay, so the mood of the syllogism is determined by the types of standard form categorical propositions used in the syllogism. Okay, so bear in mind we've got 4 standard form categorical propositions. Okay, and the shorthand notation stands for those 4 letters. Okay, so this is what the letters represent. Okay, the first letter is going to be the major premise. Okay, let's say our major premise is an A statement. The second letter is going to be the minor premise. And let's say that in this case, the minor premise is an I. And then the last letter is going to be the conclusion. And let's say that our conclusion is another I statement. Okay, so if the major premise is an A, the minor premise is an I, and the conclusion is an I, that means that the actual mood of this syllogism would be AII. Okay, now, and again, this shorthand notation needs to be understood in this order. So the first letter of the mood is always going to be the major premise. The second letter of the mood is always going to be the minor premise. And then the last letter of the mood is always going to be the conclusion. Okay, so this shorthand notation corresponds to a standard form syllogism. So if your syllogism is not in standard form, you're going to have the wrong idea about what the mood actually is, right? You're going to be, you could confuse the conclusion for one of the premises. You could confuse the major premise for the minor premise. Either way here, having syllogism in standard form just helps us to clarify things and keep things abundantly clear. Okay, now, so that's the mood. Now, the figure of the categorical syllogism is determined by the placement of the middle term. Okay, so there's only 4 possible combinations for the middle term. Okay, so first let's go with figure 1 here. Okay, with figure 1, the middle term is going to appear first in the major premise, all right, and is going to appear second in the minor premise. So let me just go ahead and label these premises here. So in figure 1, the major premise is going to have the middle term first, and then the minor premise is going to have the minor term first and the middle term second. Okay, so where M stands for middle term, P stands for major term, S stands for minor term, and then M again stands for middle term. This is how figure 1 is going to look. So in figure 1, the middle term is first in the major premise and second in the minor premise. All right. Okay. In figure 2, the middle term appears second. Whoops, I should probably put a space between those. The major term appears second in both premises. Okay. So in figure 2, the middle term is the second term, the predicate term of the major premise, and is also the predicate term of the minor premise. Okay, figure 3. In figure 3, the middle term is the subject term of both premises. All right, so in figure 3, the middle term will be the subject term of the major premise. It will also be the subject term of the minor premise. All right, the only other possible combination is figure 4. Okay, so in figure 4, the middle term appears second in the major premise, and the middle term appears first in the minor premise. Okay, so in figure 1, it's diagonal with the middle term being the subject of the major premise and the predicate term of the minor premise. And then in figure 4, it's just the opposite. So in figure 4, the major term, or I'm sorry, the middle term is the predicate term of the major premise and then is the subject term of the minor premise. Okay, now, and as I mentioned in a previous video, since categorical syllogisms depend upon distribution rules of propositions in order to be valid and invalid, that's why if you just get familiar with moods and figures here, you can just look at the mood and figure of a syllogism and be able to tell whether it's valid or invalid. Okay, so for example, if I had start with an easy one. Okay, let's go with an AAI, or I'm sorry, an AAA2. Okay, so that means that the major premise is an A statement, the minor premise is an A statement, and the conclusion is an A statement. Okay, so if we wrote this out, what it would be, and I'm going to have to move this up in order to not run out of room. Okay, so if we wrote this out, since it's in figure 2, this would be all P are M, all S are M, therefore all S are P. Okay, all P are M, all S are M, therefore all S are P. Okay, now, so once again, keep in mind what terms are being distributed here. So in an A statement, the only terms that are being distributed are the subjects, okay? So the major term is distributed here, the minor term is distributed here, and then the minor term is distributed in the conclusion, okay? So this middle term, since we are in figure 2, the middle term is being undistributed in both premises, okay? Now, but since there is a rule which says that the middle term needs to be distributed at least once, we know that an AAA2 is going to be invalid automatically, right? So since I know that one of the rules for validity is that the middle term of the syllogism must be distributed at least once. Well, in AAA2, right, where the middle term appears second, it appears as the predicate in both premises. Given that both the premises are A statements, I know that that middle term is going to be undistributed in both of those premises. So this would be invalid. Okay, now here's another example. If you had an AAI, and it doesn't even matter what the figure is, right? An AAI4, so that would be some P, whoops, some PRM, some M or S, therefore some S or P, okay? Now, what terms do I statements distribute? Well, they don't distribute anything. Okay, now, and again, the figure here is irrelevant. Anytime both of your premises are I statements, regardless of the figure, the problem here is with the mood, right? So since this premise doesn't distribute any terms, and this premise doesn't distribute any terms, well, given that the middle term has to be distributed at least once, any syllogism where both of the premises are I statements is automatically going to be invalid. So if you saw this shorthand notation, and again, it doesn't even matter what the conclusion is, an IIO would be invalid, an IIA would be invalid, an IIE would be invalid, an III is invalid, right? Since both premises are I statements, you know automatically the middle term is going undistributed, so you know automatically that it is going to be invalid, okay? Now, so since there are 4 figures, and there are actually, how many moods? Off the top of my head, I don't know, but there's a total of 256 categorical syllogisms based on all of the moods and figures, right? There's 64 moods, just did the math on a calculator. Okay, so there's 64 moods and there are 4 figures. So that means that there are 256 different kinds of categorical syllogism. And in the next videos, we're going to go over all 256. No, we're not going to do that. If I were really mean, you know, we'd go over all 256, but I'm not that mean. I'm a little bit mean, but not that mean. Okay. All right, let's go over a couple more examples here. Let's go with an EIO, oops, not EI0. Let's do an EIO3. Okay, so the major premise is an E statement, and it's in figure 3. So that means that the middle term is going to be the subject term of both premises, right? So the major term or major premise is an E statement. That would be M or P, right? The minor premise is an I statement. And once again, it's in figure 3. Some MRS. And the conclusion is an O statement. Therefore, some S are not P. Throw a therefore in there. All right, so no MRP, some MRS, therefore some S are not P. Okay, now, and this is a valid syllogism. Okay, so using this argument, anytime the premises are true, the conclusion is going to be true. This is deductively valid in categorical logic. Okay, all right, let's do another example. Let's do an EIE1. Okay, so it's in figure 1. So since it's in figure 1, that means that the middle term is the subject of the major premise, and the middle term is the predicate of the minor premise. Okay. All right, so that would be no M or P. Okay. The minor premise is an I, statement, and we're in figure, whoops, we're in figure 1, not figure 3. Okay, so that would be some S Rm. And our conclusion is another E statement, so that would be therefore no S Rp. So no MRP, some SRM, therefore no SRP. Okay, now this is invalid, actually. Okay, now there's another rule which says that any terms that are distributed in the conclusion need to be distributed in their corresponding premise. Okay, so S and P are both being distributed in the conclusion. Well, P is being distributed here. The major term is being distributed. M is being distributed here. Now, but since the conclusion is an E statement, the minor term, S, is being distributed in the conclusion, but it's not being distributed in this premise, okay? So since the rule says that any terms that are distributed in the conclusion must be distributed in their corresponding premise, this would be invalid, okay? Okay, so we've got 64 moods, we've got 4 figures, all right? And if you just can remember the distribution rules, that's very helpful in determining whether these syllogisms are valid or invalid. Okay, now since I've mentioned a couple of the rules, I'm just gonna go ahead and give you all of the rules here. Okay, rules for validity. Okay, one we've already mentioned. Middle term must be distributed at least once. All right. Now, keep in mind what at least once means. The middle term can be distributed more than once. It's not a problem if it's distributed more than once. That's what we call superfluous distribution. So if the middle term is distributed twice, that's fine. It just needs to be distributed at least once. So the middle term must be distributed at least once. 2, any terms distributed in the conclusion must be distributed in their corresponding premise. So if the minor term is distributed in the conclusion, the minor term must be distributed in the minor premise. If the major term is distributed in the conclusion, the major term must be distributed in the major premise. Now, if the conclusion doesn't distribute any terms, the only time you would have that is if the conclusion is an I statement. The only time the conclusion would not distribute any terms is if the conclusion were an I statement, then neither the minor term nor the major term needs to be distributed. They can be distributed, but again, that would be another example of superfluous distribution. So the rule says that any terms distributed in the conclusion must be distributed in the corresponding premise. It does not say any terms distributed in the premises must be distributed in the conclusion. That's not what it says, right? Okay. Rule 3 is that 2 negative premises are not allowed. So you cannot have an EEE be valid. You can't have an EOE be valid, right? Any combination of 2 negative premises, OOO, EEE, EOOE, those are always going to be invalid. Okay. If at least one premise is negative, the conclusion must be negative. And if the conclusion is negative, both premises cannot be affirmative. So a negative premise requires a negative conclusion, and a negative conclusion requires at least one negative premise. Now, but keep in mind, both premises cannot be negative. So if at least one premise is negative, the conclusion must be negative, and if the conclusion is negative, then exactly one of the premises needs to be negative. Okay, now, and then rule 5 is that if both the premises are universal, the conclusion cannot be particular. So if both of the premises are universal, the conclusion cannot be particular. Okay, so this is what's known as the existential fallacy, right? Now, so this rule applies to the Boolean or modern interpretation of logic here. Okay, so this rule varies in traditional logic. Okay, in traditional logic, you can derive a particular from universal premises. Why? Because remember that for Aristotle, universal statements imply existence. Okay, so, but again, in order to determine whether a syllogism is valid in Aristotelian logic and traditional logic, you have to be able to determine whether critical terms, okay, actually refer to actually existing things. So if a critical term has empty extension, meaning a critical term does not refer to an actual entity, then the syllogism is invalid. Okay, so as I mentioned in a previous video, in traditional logic, there is a such thing as conditional validity. In modern logic and Boolean logic, there is no such thing as conditional validity. Okay, now, but for our purposes, we're not going to be using the traditional perspective at all. So in modern logic, you cannot derive a particular conclusion from a set of all universal premises. If both your premises are universal, the conclusion cannot be particular. All right, in traditional logic and Aristotelian logic, you can do this, but you got to be able to determine whether critical terms refer to one actual entity. If they don't, then the syllogism is invalid. But like I said previously, in modern logic, we do not care whether our terms actually refer to anything. Modern logic is what's known as ontologically innocent in that regard. Universal statements are not understood as to have any sort of existential import. So we're not going to worry about the rule in the traditional perspective. We're only going to be looking at the rule in the modern perspective. Okay. Okay. So let me give you a couple of examples here. I'll move this up. La la la. All right. So let's go with an AAA4 here. Okay. So in figure 4, the major premise is an A. So in figure 4, the middle term is the predicate. So that would be A, M, right? M or S. Therefore, no S or P. Okay, so the major premise is an A, the minor premise is an A, the conclusion is an E. So all P are M, all M are S in figure 4, right? So that's figure 4. Therefore, no S or P. Okay, let's look at the rules. So rule 1, the middle term must be distributed at least once. Okay, so the middle term is not distributed in the major premise, right? Only the major term is E, right? So middle term here is going undistributed. Now, but the middle term is distributed here. The middle term is distributed here in the minor premise, okay? So this follows rule 1. Now, rule 2, any terms distributed in the conclusion must be distributed in their corresponding premise, okay? So the conclusion is distributing both S and P. So P, the major term, is being distributed in the major premise, so that's fine. However, the minor premise is only distributing M, so that means that the minor term in the minor premise is going undistributed. So this violates rule 2, right? So S is distributed, the minor term is distributed in the conclusion, but it's not being distributed in the minor premise, so this violates rule 2, okay? 2 negative premises are not allowed. Well, both my premises are affirmative, all right? And 4, if at least one premise is negative, the conclusion must be negative. And if the conclusion is negative, both premises cannot be affirmative, okay? Well, I've got a negative conclusion, but both my premises are affirmative, okay? So this also violates rule 4, all right? So since a negative conclusion requires that exactly one of the premises also be negative, I can't have two affirmative premises and a negative conclusion. So this violates rule 2, it violates rule 4, so it's invalid for that reason. Now, and if you don't want to take my word for it, you could actually do a counterexample here. Okay, so all cats are mammals, all PRM, all mammals are animals, all MRS, therefore no animals, whoops, therefore no animals, cats. All right, that's clearly false. Okay, so all PRM, all MRS, therefore no SRP, that is clearly invalid. I've got two true premises and a false conclusion. Okay. All right, let's do an EIO2. All right, so once again, the major premise is an E statement. It's in figure 2, so that means that the middle term is going to be the predicate of both premises. So no PRM, all right? The minor premise is an I statement in figure 2, some SRM, and the conclusion is an O statement. Therefore, some S are not P. Okay. All right, let's look at the rules. First of all, the middle term must be distributed at least once. Okay, so the middle term is being distributed here in the major premise, so we're good there. Second rule, any terms distributed in the conclusion must be distributed in their corresponding premise. Okay, well, P is being distributed in the conclusion since this is an O statement. Now, but P is being distributed in the major premise, right? So O distributes this term here, but since the E statement distributes both, since the major premise is an E statement, this is why it follows rule 1 and rule 2, right? Two negative premises are not allowed, right? My major premise is negative, my minor premise is affirmative, so this follows rule 3, right? If at least one premise is negative, the conclusion must be negative, and if the conclusion is negative, both premises cannot be affirmative. All right, I've got exactly one negative premise, and I've got a negative conclusion. Okay, so it follows rule 4. And if both the premises are universal, the conclusion cannot be particular. Well, I've got a particular conclusion, and I've got a particular premise, and a universal premise. So I've got a universal premise, particular conclusion. This follows rule 5, all right? So in EIO2, this would be a valid syllogism. Okay, so what does that tell us? So following all 5 of these rules, each of these rules is individually necessary and jointly sufficient for validity. So any syllogism which breaks at least one of these rules is invalid, and any syllogism which follows all 5 of these rules is valid. So any syllogism that breaks at least one of these rules is automatically invalid, and any syllogism which follows all 5 of these rules is automatically valid. So this is a set of individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for standard form categorical logic. So standard form categorical syllogism in the Boolean or modern interpretation, as long as the syllogisms follow these rules, they're going to be valid. Right? Now, and here's a hint. All of the EIOs are valid regardless of the figure. Every single EIO syllogism. So if you see the mood EIO, you can sing Old MacDonald Had a Farm, but you'll also know all the EIOs are automatically valid regardless of the figure. EIO1 is valid, EIO2 is valid, EIO3 is valid, and EIO4. They are all valid, right? So keep that in your memory bank. That's a useful hint, okay? All right, so we've got the rules, we've got moods and figures, lots of fun stuff here. Okay, so in the video for next week, we'll be talking about how to do Venn diagrams, categorical syllogisms. And those can be somewhat confusing, so we'll spend as much time on that as we actually need to. I'll see you all then.